Hey Andy, I see we have about 120 people live. Are you ready?
I am all set.
Awesome. There's still a few people joining in, but I know you have a ton of content to present, so let's get started. Before we actually go into really fun stuff, let me do some of the a bit boring but necessary housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded and will be shared to everyone who registered within about 48 hours after the event. If you want to share it with colleagues, rewatch some of the great information that Andy will be sharing, you're most welcome to. But now, really welcome everyone. I see we're at 150 now. Welcome to this best practices migrating your SharePoint designer workflows to Power Automate. My name is Vlad Catrinescu. I will be your host, and I'm joined today by a very good friend, Microsoft MVP, amazing trainer, conference speaker, and I love that smile. Well, official name William Huneycutt, but Andy is how most people call you, right?
Yep. Go by Andy.
Go by Andy. Awesome. Well, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. As Vlad mentioned, I'm William, but I go by Andy. I am from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm a SharePoint trainer, but also work with Office 365, Microsoft Teams, pretty much everything underneath the Microsoft 365 umbrella. I've been doing professional training instruction now for over 10 years in just the Microsoft ecosystem. I've had the pleasure of traveling all over North America and working with companies large and small to implement and work with these services. My primary role outside of trainer is enterprise collaboration specialist. It's learning about all the different tools and technologies that we have and being able to implement those and um, put them into practice so that you can make the most out of your investment. Primarily, I run my own company called Upskill Tech. I've been doing that for a number of years now, basically training and coaching, consulting services there. But I also work with ASBE, a C Prime company. That's my primary training contract. I've been working with them since January 2011. I'm a senior trainer, coach, courseware developer, and consultant with them. As Vlad mentioned, I've had the opportunity to speak at a number of conferences, SharePoint Fest being one of the biggest ones that I speak at. Really love that conference and the community that it brings in. I'm based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. I run the Charlotte area SharePoint user group along with a few of my colleagues. And we also do SharePoint Saturday events, kind of behind my head there. But we run SharePoint and Office 365 Saturday in the Carolinas. So our next event, I believe, is going to be in October. Really looking forward to that. I did put my contact information right over here, mirrors, right over here. So feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. That's usually some of the best places to get a hold of me. Email addresses on there as well, but definitely Twitter, reach out to me there. And I also have a blog, upskilltech.blog. I do some blogging there, and I also do blogging at Jump to 365 with Matt Wade, which is pretty cool. So that's way too much about me. I think we're ready to dive into the main event here.
Awesome. Why are we here today? What's the big news that kind of made this webinar so popular? Let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so July 6th, Microsoft caught everybody off guard because they announced that starting in August and through like November, that if you're in SharePoint Online, they are removing the functionality for SharePoint 2010 workflows. And that means your out-of-the-box workflows and your custom workflows created using SharePoint Designer. They are turning that functionality off in SharePoint Online for existing tenants in November, but for new tenants, any new tenants created starting in August, they're removing that workflow engine from SharePoint Online or SharePoint in Microsoft 365. And they're saying that we need to either go to Power Automate or we need to figure out another solution.
And I mean, we all kind of knew this was coming. I think the biggest like off guard was how fast we had to, and kind of we. I mean, it's been deprecated for a while as well, but nobody knew when and how fast.
Exactly. Now, in Microsoft's defense, this has been something that they've talked about for a while now. They originally made the announcement that SharePoint Designer and InfoPath were going to be deprecated in January of 2014, and they said that they were going to have a replacement in the fall. They just didn't say what year that they were referring to, and we actually got that information in the fall of 2016. We got the Power Platform, and that's when we were introduced to Power Apps, and at the time, Microsoft Flow, but it's since been renamed Power Automate. So the writing's been on the wall for a while now, and it took a little while for both Power Automate and Power Apps to mature to the level that it could replicate and exceed the capabilities of what Designer and InfoPath could do, because there was a number of years of development behind those products. So we've technically known, since 2014 that there was going to be something else coming out. And then in 2016, that's when, okay, Microsoft said that's where we really need to think about going. And then those products have matured over the last couple of years. But like you said, we didn't get a whole lot of notice because this announcement was made on July 6th, and that's less than 5 months for a lot of really large enterprises and even small shops to look at what all they have and then get ready to make that that transition to this new service and these new tools. So I know kind of along with that, there's been a lot of other webinars and a lot of other people in the SharePoint community talking about this and really commenting on it. I did a top of mind slide because I knew we were going to have a little bit of a conversation here at the beginning. Just a top of mind slide for some things that I was thinking about as I was putting this together, but also some of the things that the community is definitely talking about. I know Todd Clinton and Mark Anderson at some Praxis, they did a webinar a couple weeks ago where they did a really good breakdown of some of this. I know Shane Young did a video on YouTube, on his YouTube channel, where he talked about Power Automate. John Liu from Australia, he's Power Automate guru ninja. He's done some stuff, but also Microsoft's pushed out a number of blogs pretty quickly and a lot of content. And I'm going to reference some of that as we move through this. But I just had some learnings that were top of mind, and we're going to address some of this as we're kind of moving through the materials here today. Things that we're going to need to think about are not only migrating, but like using the services in Power Automate and how that's going to affect some of what you're doing. Things like service accounts, that's going to be a big consideration. We'll talk a little bit about licensing toward the end of this webinar. But service accounts are going to be something that we have to have a hard conversation about. And there's been a lot of conversations about this for a few years now. PowerShell, if you're not familiar with PowerShell and you're going to be doing this migration, this might be something that you want to strongly consider learning. And Vlad happens to be an expert on PowerShell, so I definitely check out his material and some of the books and content that he's written around that. But PowerShell is going to be really helpful for you to do things like a modernization scanner. And as part of that scanner, you can see how many legacy workflows you're actually running in your environment. It might be just a handful. It could be hundreds or even thousands of legacy workflows. PowerShell is going to help you to work with that, but you're going to need to run that scanner in order to figure out what you have, if it's active, and then you're going to need to communicate with your users around that. Another thing to consider is scanning for flows. There's the Flow Admin Center that we get. That's Power Automate's Admin Center. There's the Flow Admin Center, but you need to have an idea of what you have in your environment. Know who your citizen developers are, know who your power users are, and just get an idea at a high level of what you're doing. Get some reporting around that. There's some PowerShell around that. John Liu did a pretty amazing, open source project around that you should definitely check out. But some other things, and again, this is just top of mind as I get ready to dive into this. You need to unlearn what you know. And I'm going to talk a lot about that as we're moving through here. What you did in SharePoint Designer doesn't apply one-to-one in Power Apps, or Power Automate rather, at all. So that's something that you're definitely going to need to keep in mind. Unlearning how you did things in SharePoint Designer and relearning how to do that in Power Automate. And I'll give you some examples. Some other things to consider, data connections and gateways. There's going to be some administration that and governance that you need to think about. We'll go back and talk about that in a bit. This one's really controversial. The HTTP request SharePoint action, that's a premium action. There's a cost associated with that. It was free, now it's not. So that's going to be something we talk a little bit more about in licensing. Some things that are really near and dear to me coming from the SharePoint power user background, content type support, document sets. Those are things that I work with heavily, especially as a contractor. That really can streamline my ability to work with stuff. And using Power Automate and connecting into that, that's a story that's very much ongoing and developing. And there's a lot happening there. Some other things, John Liu brought one up that I didn't even think about. I didn't even really know about this until a couple of weeks ago. Running triggers with conditions built into it. That blew my mind. I'm going to show you that in a little bit. That's really awesome. But these are just some things top of mind to even consider before we get into this. So let's actually dive into this. So SharePoint Designer. We've known since 2014 that this product is on the way out. It's deprecated. Microsoft will support it until 2026, but that support means patching and updates. It doesn't mean any new functionality whatsoever. And as we're starting to see right now, functionality is being removed. A couple months ago, the ability to customize forms using SharePoint Designer was pulled out of SharePoint Online pretty much overnight. Some of us would use this to create custom forms and tie it into content types and then launch that via like quick actions. That got removed, and again, pretty much overnight. But we've known since 2014 that it's on the way out. And now we know that if you're in SharePoint Online today and you have workflows either out of the box or created using the 2010 workflow platform, that those are going to be shut down or turned off in November. If you have 2013 platform workflows in Designer, their support's going to continue on for those, but we don't know for how long. So really, the clock is ticking. It's time to think about a migration strategy. And if you haven't moved into the cloud yet, then something to consider is if you get a new tenant starting in August, the 2010 and the out-of-the-box functionality is going will be removed. So many things to consider there. But Designer is very much an antique, I think, at this point. So future designers, I've already mentioned, we've known since January 2014 it's on the way out. There will be no new features built into it, and even now features are being pulled out from it. Now, for those of you that are on premises, you host 2013, 2016, 2019 on your servers, you're still going to be able to work with this stuff on your servers for the life cycle there. But for those of us that are in Microsoft 365, SharePoint for Microsoft 365, or SharePoint Online, as it's referred to, we've got to rethink our approach, and the time to do that was yesterday. So the future, as I've already mentioned, August 1st is when they're going to start retiring the 2010 workflow engine and new tenants moving forward. This applies to all environments. It's not just private enterprise. This is also the government community cloud and the Department of Defense clouds. So if you're migrating from a legacy version and you're moving in there, it's really to your advantage now to start documenting your business processes, get your business analysts involved with that, know what those business process requirements are so that you can seamlessly transition into a Power Automate based solution. And then as Microsoft has said, and there's a link in the PowerPoint over here, the 2013 workflows are going to continue to be supported for a little while, but they haven't committed to exactly how long. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and I think it applies really to this particular situation. We've been able to do designer workflows even after that the announcement that it was being deprecated and that we need to look at other services. We were told that in 2014. In 2016, we got Power Automate, and it's matured a lot over the last 3.5 years. So even though we can create 20 or SharePoint Designer workflows, you really need to stop and consider. Just because you could, you need to consider whether you should. And I think that really the writing's on the wall with that now. It's time to move on. So let's talk about Designer to Power Automate and some of the things that that you need to consider as we move through this. Is Microsoft Flow and Power Automate, is that the successor to SharePoint Designer? Officially, yes. It is the evolution of workflow, though. It's not a one-to-one replacement. It's the evolution of workflow, and that's where that you need to unlearn what you know and think about some of what's coming. That's the first thing. So it is definitely the evolution, and it will be the tool that we use moving forward. But it's a cloud-based service. It runs in the cloud. It connects to your on-premises data. It connects to your gateways. It connects to your cloud services. And you run and you build these workflows right in your web browser. So you don't need to download a program to keep it up to date. Every time you open up that web browser, it's going to be up to date with the latest and greatest. But it is definitely the replacement and evolution of what we know as workflow. Now, this is a little bit confusing, especially for those of you that are a little bit newer to this. When the product was released back in 2016, it was called Microsoft Flow. Well, in November 2019, it was renamed Power Automate, and it's part of the Power Platform. Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agents, Power BI. You use Power Automate to create flows. So a lot of reference material, even from Microsoft's official site, flow.microsoft.com is still an active link. A lot of reference material says Microsoft Flow. Flow is Power Automate. Power Automate creates flows. There's different levels of workflow that it creates, but you use Power Automate to create flows. So it's a little bit interchangeable, but know that Power Automate is Microsoft Flow. Microsoft Flow is Power Automate. Now, the other thing as you're getting into this, you need to unlearn. When you created a SharePoint Designer workflow, you were pretty much encapsulated inside of that site that you were working in, meaning that you had a SharePoint site and the objects in that site, the list, the libraries, the content types, that's what your SharePoint Designer workflow would actually run on. When you get into Power Automate, it opens that up. Not only can you work within that SharePoint site that you're in and connect easily like Office and Outlook like Designer did, but you would also be able to expand that to all the other pieces and elements in Office 365. So I'm going to be able to create a workflow process that not only works with SharePoint, but it can work with OneDrive for Business, it can work with Office, it could work with Yammer, Microsoft Teams, Power Apps, Power Automate. It's going to work with all these different tools in this ecosystem. So that's something that we got to let go. It's not just about the SharePoint site that we're in. It's very easy in this environment for me to create something in one SharePoint site and pass that to another SharePoint site, even in another site collection or in another tenant. And I can do that, but there's some permissioning around it, and it can definitely be done. So that's one of the first big things. It extends what you can do through SharePoint workflows into other pieces of not only Office and Microsoft 365, but also to hundreds of connectors. As an admin, this is something that I'm definitely going to have to keep my eyes on. But right now, as of last night, Power Automate supports 373 different kinds of connections, data connections. And that doesn't even count things like your custom connectors and custom gateways, which you can definitely create. So over 370 services are supported inside of here. I really like that graphic. I'm gonna run it one more time. It connects to everything in the Microsoft ecosystem. It connects to Azure, it connects to Microsoft 365, it connects to Office 365. It connects to your on-premises information. So if you have SQL servers on-prem, if you have SharePoint on-premises, you're going to be able to connect all of that through data gateways and connectors. But you can also connect to other cloud services. Things like Box, Dropbox, and ShareFile, I can easily connect to those services and bring that content into my Power Automate workflow. I can work with Google services, I can work with Adobe services, I can work with things like Adobe Sign, I can work with DocuSign. There are over 370 services in here, but from an admin perspective, I actually have some control over this. I can limit the services that you as an end user can provision and use inside of our tenant. So through the Power Automate Admin Center, I can limit your ability to use these services. And I work with one client in they've actually limited the connectors to just Office 365. You can work with Office 365. You can't work with any external services. Everything has to be part of our tenant and it stays within our tenant. Now you might notice that there's some connectors listed here say premium, and premium is just that. There is a fee associated with that. That means that you have to pay for a premium connector, and there's a licensing associated with that. But you might also have to pay that service on their end for the use of that connector. So you might have to pay a premium service on the Microsoft end, but also a premium service on the other end of that. And just because it doesn't say premium doesn't necessarily mean it's free. Again, you might have to pay that service on the other end for the use of that service. Now, a lot of services are free, and free is free inside of here, but there are resources that kind of go into that. But through the admin center, you're going to have a lot of controls. It just depends on the service that you're trying to work with, is the cost associated with that. Licensing is a whole other thing. I got some slides on that toward the end. So there's standard connectors, premium connectors, preview connectors. Connectors have connectors. There's a lot of different connectors. In the PowerPoint, which I assume we're going to make available, I just provided a link, but this actually came from some official, recently updated documentation from Microsoft on this. And it just gives a breakdown of all the different connectors. And I do have a link to an actual description of the connectors and some of what you can do in the material. So cloud-based services, that's another thing that you need to consider. This does run in the cloud. You run Power Automate through your web browser. It connects to your cloud services, but you can connect this to your on-premises information. So if you're running SharePoint 2019, you can connect it through a gateway and you can run it there. But the flow is going to run in the cloud. So it's going to leave your firewall, go to the cloud, process, and then it's going to come back down. And sometimes you'll get a message that says, you know, this information is coming from an external entity or outside of the company. It's coming from Power Automate. There are some, you know, security concerns that you need to consider there, but it is a very much a cloud-based service. And so these are going to run in the cloud and then come back down. Sometimes there's a little latency involved with it. Sometimes they run very, very quickly. But that is one consideration from a security standpoint you definitely need to be aware of. So let's shift gears a little bit. Let's actually talk about the service. That's some high-level things to think about. We'll circle back to a little bit of that in a bit. But let's actually talk about some of migrating from Designer into Power Automate and some of the considerations that you need to make there. So with that, some verbiage, some things you need to know. SharePoint Designer has conditions. Flow, we call those condition controls. Now, in Designer, conditions are kind of limited. In Flow, it's a lot more broad. There's about 6 different types of conditions that we can work with. Actions are actions. That's the basic unit of work that happens in both environments. In SharePoint Designer, we had stages, and stages also had steps depending on the platform you're in. In Flow, we call those scope controls, also sometimes referred to as stages. SharePoint Designer has loops. In Flow Power Automate, we call those a do until control, but there's also a looping control that's built in. Parallel blocks, those are parallel branches. Start options or events, we call those triggers in Power Automate. An initiation form, for anybody who worked with initiation forms and parameters, those are trigger outputs in Power Automate. And then into workflow, we have this thing called a terminate control that we use. So there's some verbiage that's similar, but some verbiage just a little bit different that you need to be aware of. Now, out of the box workflow templates. These are deployed in all of our SharePoint sites. You go and you activate the workflow feature. You can do a feedback workflow. You can do an approval workflow. You can do a digital signature workflow. There's a 3-state workflow, but then there's also a disposition approval that's tied into records management. And there is a workflow for publishing approval that's actually associated with your site pages library, and it works with web pages in your SharePoint environment. These are out of the box, kind of lightweight pre-configured templates. They get you like 80% of the way there, but it's that last little bit that you really needed to customize to get over to really make it apply to your specific business process. With that, the out-of-the-box templates could be customized using SharePoint Designer. That was a whole thing. We what I've actually seen the use case around this over the years and how myself and many of the people in the training industry has approached this. We use the out-of-the-box workflows to teach people how the workflow process kind of work, how end users would interact with it, how you would use like email to complete workflow activities relating back to an openness task and a SharePoint task form, how it would allow you to do like sequential or parallel approvals or feedback. We would use this as a teaching tool to baseline how the workflows are supposed to behave and how end users need to interact with it. Then we would shift gears and go into working with custom workflow in SharePoint Designer. So even though we could use some of those, the thing Microsoft has told us is that those templates, many of them are going to be turned off in November. If you have, they're not going to allow you to create any new ones based off of that. I think they're going to support some running instances for a little while, but you're not going to be able to create any more of those out-of-the-box baseline generic templates. But over the last few years, Microsoft's done a really good job of implementing some of that in the Power Automate world. So we have the ability to do a quick request sign-off. This is like a one-click integration from your document library. Select a file, go to the command bar, and there it is. Request a sign-off. Enter in a name, enter in a message, and it runs the entire workflow process for you. Very, very simple. We also have a set a reminder, which we didn't have as an out-of-the-box for Designer, but that allows you to look at a list or library that has date fields, select an item, set a reminder based off of that date for the individual item or for the entire list or library, and then the flow is off and running. There's also a content approvals out of the box for identifying that content approval related to items. There's a page approval. So like in SharePoint Online, we really don't even need to turn on the SharePoint server publishing infrastructure anymore, because we can just configure a lightweight page approval flow in our site pages, and we can launch that and trigger that. And then there's a newer one, there's hub approvals. If you're doing anything with hub sites in SharePoint Online, which is pretty awesome. If you haven't started flattening and embracing the new flat world in Microsoft, there's a hub site or there's a hub association workflow that's out there. But really the value that you're gonna get is creating your own custom workflows in Power Automate. So there's not a direct one-to-one replacement for all of the out-of-the-box SharePoint Classic legacy workflows. But there's either a Power Automate equivalent or it exceeds that capability. And to get started quickly, you don't have to start from scratch. There's templates. There's hundreds of templates based off of the hundreds of services that are out there. These templates are a really great starting point. So when you go into Power Automate or Flow for the first time, you can select a template. You can use it to kind of get your experience of, to kind of understand the process and kind of base on your users off of it. But the templates are a starting point. You can customize or tweak these to whatever you need without destroying the template. You're creating an instance of the template and you're going to be able to use it. This is a great starting point. You can search through the templates for specific services like SharePoint or OneDrive or whatever you need, and it becomes a great starting location for that to get you started. And then once you kind of learn the basics, you'll kind of mature into building your own flows based off of what you know off of those templates. So it's really easy to get started quickly, but it also enables self-service flow creation, meaning end users and information workers and business users can go in and start creating their flows very quickly by selecting a template, connecting it to their list or library from a couple of drop-down menus, and then they're off and running. Now, from an admin perspective, this is self-service site, workflow creation that does kind of, scare the pants off of some admins because users are creating their own workflows, the governance considerations, the security considerations, how it's going to affect the business as people come and go. Those are things to consider, but this gives a way for end users, information users, to start learning the process, and then they can start building their business processes. Then our citizen developers and power users can take this to the next level, and it can, in many cases, lower some of the administrative overhead that our IT teams face. So that's kind of the template game. Some things to kind of quickly start on and to consider. But let's talk about like actually creating a workflow. So in the SharePoint Designer world, and even out of the box, this is what we worked with. We would add a workflow to our object, our list or library, or even our content type. And we had the content type support. We choose the template, whether it's a globally reusable workflow or custom reusable workflow that we've created. We would name that. That will become a column where we can track the process inside of SharePoint. We would associate it with a task list and a history list for privacy, security considerations. And then we would pick our start options. And there's 4.5 start options listed there, but that's pretty much what it was limited to. And this was our primary association. And one of the biggest weaknesses, I think, of this workflow model, especially in hindsight, is that it's so locked into the SharePoint site. But we live in a world where mobile and working on the device that we have and where we are is really, really important. So for me to have to stop what I'm doing, log into a SharePoint site, navigate to a task list, view the tasks that are there, complete it from there, and not to be able to do it from my mobile phone or from like an email, really bottlenecked and really turned a lot of users off to the workflow process overall. So this is what we did legacy. When we get into Power Automate, it opens up immensely. The first thing is when we start creating flows, you can create them from a template or you can create them from scratch. So if you go into Flow and you create them from scratch, you've got 5 different core flows that you're going to be able to work with. Automated, instant, scheduled, and then you have UI, and then you have business flows. So in Power Automate, there's 5 different types of flows that you can create, but you can also import from a template. Yes, you can import and export between environments. It's just a zip file. It's pretty easy to work with. You can also import from Visio. So you can map out, and Visio currently has flow shapes built into it. You can map out a whole process there and you can run with it. But the type of flow that you create really matters. Automated flows are probably the most common that I see. Automated flows are triggered by something, like an item is created in a list or files uploaded in a document library. Automated flows can run pretty much instantly based off of that. Then there are instant flows, and instant flows are actually really cool. I'm a big fan of some of the instant flows. We'll see more. I got a screenshot of this coming up in just a bit. But one of the things that I like about instant flows is that it's triggered by like an action, like a button, for instance, like a virtual button on your mobile device. So you can also use like a flick button or a Bluetooth button and run one of these, which is really cool. You can also have a form. A user fills out a form, and when they hit submit, that can trigger it as well. That's a flow option. Scheduled flows. I really love this. I can schedule a flow to run, a start time throughout the day. I can repeat it throughout that schedule. I can have it run certain days of the week. Scheduled flows allow me to have like a flow that runs like every single day. And I don't have to worry about the flow timing out. I also don't have to worry about the flow life cycle, the limitation to it, which we'll talk about a little bit later. These run on a schedule, which is really, really cool. UI flows are a little bit newer. They run on your desktop or in the web where APIs might not be available. So it can record like kind of like a series of macros on like your local device, and it can execute based off of that. And then we also have the define a set of steps through a business process flow. This one's really great if you don't want end users to have to worry about them to be able to interact where they need to and to be able to quickly track where it is. We can build out a business process flow. Kind of reminds me of like a state machine flow where the end user just worries about their interaction and they don't worry about all the sequential steps that make that up. And this also has a really good visual indicator built into it. So these are all the different flow types that that we can create. Now, one of the things that is kind of the limitation for me is the content type association. I'm a really big fan of this, and right now, and as of last night, unless something changed in like the last 12 hours, the content type support for workflow association is still for the legacy workflows and the custom workflows in Designer. It's not there for Power Automate yet. That doesn't mean I can't run Power Automate on a content type, but like I like using the content type hub. I like using content types in my sites and my site collections where I can build a content type once and I can reuse it across many different objects within that site. So I can tie things like my site columns to it. I can associate document templates to files. I can tie a workflow to that. And then I used to do information management policies as well. And if I made any changes to the content type, including the workflow, anywhere that those changes were made, it would automatically push to the corresponding objects. That was a big thing for me. I still use that when I have Designer workflows around. but some of that functionality is just not there yet. You know, it's maybe coming in the fall. We'll see what year they're referring to with that. But that was one thing that it's a little bit limited for creating workflows. There's some things I can do. I just don't get that central management of it yet, maybe in the future. Now, beyond creating the flows, a couple things to also break down settings-wise. So this is the legacy settings screen that we work with. And anybody who's worked with designer workflows knows that if you do anything with task lists or history lists, you have to set that association at the very beginning of the workflow. And then if you change that association after you've created the workflow, a whole bunch of connections inside of the workflow break. So I have to do things like my task lists and history list association first. I have to do my content type association first. Then when I hit publish, it would generate forms, and those would be forms for the initiation form parameters, for the task forms, maybe for the association form itself, or for the request change form. But I don't get that until after the fact. You used to be able to customize these with InfoPath, and then it was ASPX pages after that. That was something that, you know, we had to, power users had to learn and had to work with. But we had that workflow association, the list that it was associated with, unless it was a reusable workflow, and then we had the associated task list and history list. Those were very much inside of the site. And by default, they would use this, all workflows would use the same task list and the same history list, unless we decided to kind of compartmentalize it a little bit, which we had some of the capabilities to actually do that. Well, Power Automate, it's a whole new ballgame. The settings screens are a little bit different, and there's some really cool things in there. First and foremost, you edit from here, just like you would your legacy workflows, but you have the option to turn it on or off, which is really cool. I can turn on a workflow for a while, and then I can go to the workflow and I can turn it off here, and that turns it off wherever it happens to be used. But additionally, I can run analytics. There's a Power BI dashboard built off of this, so I can see things like runs and run history. And speaking of run history, I get a 28-day run history here, where I can go back and review all the runs that I have. I can see what succeeded, I can see failed runs, and I can rerun a failed run using the exact same data. That's a game changer. So if it fails, I can see why it failed. I can either re-edit the workflow and use the same data and run it again and make it successful, or I can figure out why it failed and I can debug it. So that 28-day run history is definitely a game changer for that. So being able to go back and rerun is definitely awesome. But the other thing, now I don't know if I would call it awesome, that is kind of a consideration, is the connections and the owners. So the flow is owned by me, the creator. It uses my credentials to connect to those services to run the flow. So it's tied to me and my user account. So if I leave the organization and other people are dependent on this, IT's got to go back and fix it. With that, though, we have the ability to add in other owners to a flow. So that means that other owners could go back and view like the run history, but also they could go back and maybe tie in some additional actions based off of the connections that are already there. And we could actually pass the ownership over to the SharePoint list. So as you know, the SharePoint group membership changed, like maybe the owners group, as the group membership changed, the site could own the flow and then the connections. But this is a big point of contention that you need to consider. I built the flow and I'm passing ownership to you for the flow or to other site owners for the flow, and you're using my connections. What are you going to do with that? There's some level of concern associated with that. So for the longest time, there's been a conversation around, can we use service accounts? Some companies want to use it. Some companies are like, nope. But then there was some murky guidance from the Microsoft on this. I have it on authority from the actual Power Automate team, and I have a recording of this. And there were a bunch of other people in the room with me. You can use service accounts provided that they're licensed. So there's a use case for when you should use service accounts versus when you shouldn't. But the connectors and the ownership of the flow, that's the thing that you need to consider. So a best practice for me is if I create a flow for my team, or if I create a flow in a contract situation, what I do is I actually save a copy of that flow and export it as a zip file. And it keeps my connections intact, but when you import that file back in, you can reconfigure the connections to either the next person or to a service account. So anytime I create a flow, I save it as a copy. You can upload it in a document library in SharePoint and you can make it available. But that's going to kind of help you to deal with people coming and going in the organization and the flows breaking. In addition to that file that you can export with the flow, you can import and export these between environments. So you can go from development to production with this or across tenants. You can also, because it's a file in a library, you could also include documentation, which I definitely recommend with that. And so that's going to help you to have a backup copy and then to work with that. But that's more of an informal thing that I do, and I definitely recommend you do the same thing. All right. Flows owned by lists and libraries. I just covered that a little bit. This just breaks it down a little bit more. But the flow owned by the list or library means that if you're part of a group that I add access to, you have the manage list permission, you're going to be able to work with that flow and the connection and keep it up to date. That's also going back to something I said earlier, the PowerShell and running the scanner. Keeping track of all the flows that you have out there is really important. All right, so creating the flows. Now let's talk about triggers. This is the events that actually kick off a flow, and this is where it actually starts to be really powerful. So remember, SharePoint Designer had 4.5 triggers. Well, SharePoint alone has 12. That's just SharePoint. That doesn't count Outlook, which has 7 or 8 of its own, or OneDrive, which has like 12 or 15 of its own, or any of the other 373 services out there. They all have triggers. So these triggers can launch a flow, and there's hundreds of triggers that you can actually use. So some are connected to web services, like things in SharePoint, or external. Like you can actually have Twitter, a tweet appears with a certain hashtag. You can have that run, and you can actually trigger a flow process off of that. There are other flows that are built, have triggers that are built in, like they run on a schedule. I'm a big fan of that, but also the button, like I mentioned earlier. So there's a manual button that you can run, like a Bluetooth button, or you can run it on like a virtual button, which is really cool. But with the triggers, different services have different triggers, and there's even the option to do a manual input and actually tie that to a form. So this is like your new initiation parameters form. So we would create an initiation parameters and variables. We would tie that to a form, and then we would launch that on a workflow that was started manually. Well, we can build the same thing in Power Automate. It's just limits to a certain number of or certain column types here, but we can create that initial form, shows up on the side panel in SharePoint, and they can launch it. But you can use triggers from a whole bunch of other services as well, which really opens up your workflow capabilities. For example, an email from a certain person arrives with an attachment on it. We can automatically move that attachment to maybe a folder in our OneDrive, or maybe to a library inside of SharePoint, and then maybe start like an invoice approval process around that. Really streamlines it. Running on a schedule. I'm a big fan of this. I mentioned this a couple of times. This is one of the things I think where the capabilities of Power Automate really extend or exceed what SharePoint could do, designer workflow. I was just talking earlier today about the SharePoint Designer pause for duration or pause until a certain time. It worked with mixed results. Sometimes the services would just freeze up and it just wouldn't work. We can run these on a schedule in Power Automate, and it's pretty accurate. I can pick the frequency and the interval. I can pick the start times, how many times I want to run that within that schedule, which is great. So this is how I can actually run a flow on a schedule and exceed the flow limitation for how long a flow can actually run. I can just run it once a day, every day as I need it, and I get the results that I need. And then there's the triggers themselves. This is the thing John Liu opened my mind up to. I didn't even know about this until a few weeks ago. For a long time, I've gone in and I've done things like when I a SharePoint specific workflow, limit by views. So like I only want to run a flow on certain items that appear in a certain view. Like I'm using a filter in a view to narrow it down. Had mixed results with that. I got another slide coming up in a second to address that. But if you go into a trigger, you can go into the settings, and in the settings, there's a section in there called trigger conditions. And you can use query language, and you can build in a trigger condition that only executes when certain, like when a new item is created, when certain triggers are present. That's awesome. So like I can point at a specific column and say, hey, this field is what I'm looking for when this new item is created, and then I can actually launch that. That's a game changer. So being able to go in and do the settings and the trigger conditions, that is that addresses that. Also, when an item is created or modified, we can say, this field is different. That kind of addresses that as well. You can also do a filter array, which is really cool. So you get a whole bunch of items coming in. Well, using like OData, I can do a filter array, and they've updated this so that you can say pick a value is equal to, and then you can pick the value. But if you really want to, you can go into the advanced editor and you can use query language, and you can build out what you want inside of there. I use this a lot. One of the things it really helps with is I have a really large list, tens of thousands of items, and we've known about that SharePoint list threshold. Even though it's in the tens of thousands of items now, using a filter array means I can grab a whole bunch of items, get rid of everything that I don't need, narrow it down to that subset, and just using OData filter, which is a little developery, I can meet that condition. And then I've already mentioned the buttons. I just really like this slide. I use these, for demos all the time. I use these at conferences, just walk around the room, have people press the button and things happen on the screen. It's pretty cool. You can tie your Bluetooth buttons into your mobile device or into your computer, and then you can have that actually trigger it, or you can do like a flick button. I imagine that's the same thing, or you can do a virtual button on your mobile app, and you can trigger a flow from there. All right, so shifting gears. Actions. So whole bunch of different things to think about when it comes to triggers. What about actions? Well, when it comes to actions, there are hundreds of actions, thousands of actions for all the different services that you're going to work with. So we talked about the triggers just a moment ago. The actions are going to be specific to the service that you're working with. So the cool thing is you can search very quickly. You can narrow it down to just what you're looking for. Last I counted, which is last week, SharePoint currently supports 46 actions. And there's actually a one-to-one for a lot of the default actions that SharePoint Designer supported. But I know there's some limitations, and I'll go ahead and address that now. Item level permissions. I have to do an HTTP request to SharePoint for that, and I have to do JSON. That's not supported right now. So if you need to do item level permissions in a workflow, you're going to have to use that premium connector, and you're going to have to do JSON in order to make that happen. Serge Luca, Dr. Flo, has a whole blog on that. Go check that out. So item level permissions is one. Support for document sets. That's another big consideration. So I've done some flows where I ran an approval on a document set and it worked, but it's not the same as the document set actions that we had in SharePoint 2010. So that's another consideration that you need to make. Now, the other what was it? It'll come back to me in a second. Sorry, there's some comments over there. Sorry, yeah, there's the HTTP to SharePoint is not premium. That's my fault. There's another action similar to that is premium, and I always get them mixed up in my head. But the document sets is one thing to consider, and then the item level permissions is another to consider. But outside of that, there's some really cool things. I can create an action or a stage inside of my workflow. I can copy that to the clipboard, and I can reuse it many different times in the same flow. Clipboard functionality is relatively new, but you can save time with that, which is really cool. Paste it into the clipboard and then reuse it so you can just tweak the action as you need as you're moving through. And you'll see you have the ability to sort by built-in, standard, premium, and even custom connectors inside of here. All right, so there are the 12 triggers that get you started with the SharePoint connectors, and then there's 46 triggers that apply to, or sorry, 46 actions that apply to the actual SharePoint services themselves. But there is actually a really good blog by Microsoft. It was updated on July 21st. They compared every single action in SharePoint Designer to the Flow equivalent, and they told you whether it was available in both Flow or SharePoint Designer. There'll be a link in the PowerPoint for that, which is pretty awesome. Also, I've used this as reference material. These are all the actions that are there. These are actually hyperlinks that take you to the actual file where this stuff actually exists. So there's, in Power Automate, one of the things I think that's actually really cool is that you have these, you have the documents where not only do they state the purpose of it, but they give you examples. They show you how you can actually use it in line with your Power Automate and what the desired outcomes are going to be. That's a game changer for me because all the reference material and examples are already there, and it shows the outcome, and it shows actions that have been deprecated, And it also shows like version 1, version 2, version 3 of certain actions. So if you see it in like an old template, you can still work with it. This information actually came from there. I use this all the time. I just keep it as like reference material. I'll put it in the PowerPoint for anybody who wants it so you can check that out. All right, so actions are the basic unit of work, and the flow editor goes sequentially from top to bottom, but you have branching built into it, and branching is actually based off of conditions. Conditions are what the logic of the workflow is all about. So the logic is actually conditional, and they've updated the condition module a couple of different times, but the first thing I'm going to point out, SharePoint did else and if else branches. And you could also include an and or an or statement. You can nest an and or an or statement in there. So designer workflows supported that. Well, there's like 6 different types of conditions here. You can do a condition with else if branching and nested and or statements. But you can also do things like switch cases or do until or like a loop if you need to. You can also do conditions based off of triggers, like I just showed you the trigger condition a bit ago. So the condition logic here is way beyond what you had in SharePoint Designer, which is great. Now, some of the template workflows still use this legacy editor. This is actually deprecated. So they're actually using a new editor. I'll show it on the next slide. But in the legacy editor, you could switch into the advanced mode and you could do a query condition, which was great. You can do that in your trigger conditions now if you need to. But this legacy editor only shows up in some of the templates. You can't do it in the new editor. This is the new editor. This is the new conditional editor. If you're doing just a condition, you can still do the other things like the do until or the switch case, but this is a little bit different. So inside of here, you can do like and statements. So and everything in here would have to evaluate a true in order to execute. You could do an or, so one of these could actually execute, and you can add in multiple rows and groups. It takes a little while to wrap your head around this. Like you got to do it a couple times to really get it. The Power Automate team did a couple of really good blogs on YouTube about it, so definitely check that out. But basically, like in this situation, we're saying inside of here, I'm looking for this state in any of these cities. Could be the trigger that actually causes or the condition that actually builds the logic in this workflow. And down at the bottom, I could add a new row, which maybe would apply to the state. Or here I could add a new row, well, which would apply to the city. Or I could go down here and add a new group. And so I could account for a completely different state and the subset cities that are underneath that. It just takes a little while to wrap your head around it. But I don't get that that editor on the previous screen where I can go in the query. However, it supports dynamic lookups. Dynamic lookups apply in conditions and in actions. So you click, you put your cursor in here and it shows you all of the stages and all the scopes that you pulled previously, and it can reference that in here. That's awesome. It saves you a whole lot of time in data entry, but you can also do expressions in it, which is great. All right, I know we're kind of close to the end of time. I got a few more slides I just want to get through. We're going to leave a little bit of Q&A at the end and answer some of those questions. But I just want to talk about approvals for just a moment. If you worked in 2010 workflows, one of two things happened. They were either way too simple. This guy right here, the assign a to-do item, it's not dynamic at all. It does tie to your task list, but it passes very little information over. And you have to go to the task list in the SharePoint site in order to work with it. It's not mobile friendly, and it didn't work with like an email completion. I couldn't complete the workflow from the email. On the other side of that, you had the custom task process, which was overly complicated. You had to change the criteria for when the workflow was done, the individual tasks in the workflow, and the overall process before, during, after, if it was canceled, if it expired, and everything in between. It was way too much work. And also, just like the assign a to-do item, you had to go back to the SharePoint task list to complete the process. It wasn't email friendly. It wasn't mobile friendly, and there were some workarounds. Laura Rogers did an awesome blog on how to do a lazy man approval using the SharePoint task list and email. You're basically like creating a hyperlink in your task email to go right to the approval form and they either accept or reject. She called it lazy man approval. Check out Laura Rogers' YouTube channel, Wonder Laura, lazy man approval. She did it in there. That was the closest we could get. Power Automate changes all of that. When I start an approval process, it ties it to the approval center. And the approval center actually shows up on my mobile device and it shows up in the web browser. So it puts all of my approvals in one place, but it also ties my approval into a card that shows up in email. So I can approve right inside of the card in my email, in my Outlook message box or on my mobile device. I can also use this same kind of card in Microsoft Teams in a channel. So I can complete the workflow activity from a bunch of different places. I don't have to go to the SharePoint site. So I'm not anchored by the site anymore. I can complete my portion of the approval process where I work and how I need to work. So the approval center actually ties to that. You can start an approval process. There's like 4 different approval processes that you can work with. And there are things like timeouts and properties that you can, or policies for retrying the workflow overall. And that's super helpful. In the approval center in Power Automate, I can see everything that I've received, everything that I've sent out, and I can go back and I can review my approval history for the items that are there. But it's all consolidated in one place across all of the different approvals and workflows that I need to work with. If I'm a manager, this really streamlines my ability to go back and do this, but it also applies to my mobile device. So I would be able to go into my mobile device. I can browse my activity. I can see all of my approvals in that one place, as well as being able to trigger and kick off additional approvals and so forth. So now approvals are coming to where we work, which is on mobile, which is in email, which is in Microsoft Teams, and in SharePoint, and in the approval center inside of Power Automate. So it's meeting us where we work, which I think is huge. Now, couple of interesting things. For those of you that are a little bit more dev inclined, you can do some really cool stuff by going in and you can actually peek the code inside of things like your actions and your conditions, and you can see inputs and you can see outputs and you can see the JSON that's running on the back end of this, and you can really get an idea of what's happening. For example, if you want to do a trigger condition and you really want to understand what's happening, you can go into like an action, peek the code, and you can see, okay, this is how they're filtering. This is the formula they're using to filter for this specific thing. Let me go and apply that to my trigger code up top, copy and paste, and then just change your columns or your fields inside of there. I think that's just really, really cool. So to peek the code, that's going to go toward those more dev inclined individuals. HTTP requests. So this allows you to send an HTTP request to SharePoint. You can pick your method, and then you can get into some of the JSON, and you can use this as a way to do like item level permissions, like I mentioned just a little bit ago from Serge Luca's blog, Dr. Flow. There's guidance on how to use this, but getting into the HTTP request eventually is going to lead you into maybe some premium connectors and some additional costs that you need to consider on top of that, and also some how that's going to affect the service. There's also something in Power Automate that you can consider. It's called environments. And environments are what are used to actually host the resources that the Flow or the Power Automate actually uses. And you can use different environments for different processes. You can have a development environment and then copy and export this over into a production environment when you're ready, but keep it underneath the same tenant. It's basically an isolation boundary. So it isolates based off of connections and connectors. And it's in that controlled, kind of like a sandbox, and so you can work with it. But you can also, inside of here, take advantage of the 2 different roles. You can have admins that oversee an environment, and then you can have makers that work within that environment. And you can use these environments to build out flows across your organization so that you have the controls in place around things like users and security groups, so that they're using the services that you want them to use, but you're giving them the freedom to do self-service flow creation. There's some limitations that are associated with that, but using environments is an interesting way to handle some of like the service account considerations that you might run into, but also to handle the custom connectors. So you can open up a set of connectors for one environment and a certain group of people in your org, while limiting the connectors for a whole bunch of other people in the organization. There's some links in here to check out the blogs on this. This was, I think, newish toward the end of 2019, and some of the features. So definitely check that out. I don't have time to go into everything licensing. We would be here for the rest of the afternoon, and I'm sure we'd have to get Rob Windsor and a whole bunch of our other colleagues, Mark Anderson, involved in the conversation on licensing. But there is a licensing guide from the Power Automate, Power Apps team that you definitely need to read. There are licensing considerations for some of the premium connectors and some of the service calls that you need to be aware of. These licensing fees do apply depending on the type of app that you build. So there's a PDF that you can download. This is the most recent copy of it. I'll provide a link in the PowerPoint here. But if you're in Office 365, here's some things that should help put your mind at ease. If you're a licensed Office 365 user, you get Power Automate provided it's a non-premium connection as part of your licensing. So you're going to be able to connect to things like Office 365 data, no problem. You're going to be able to work with SharePoint and OneDrive and use Power Automate there. There is an API limitation, like a per user API call limitation that you're going to be able to, that you're going to have to take into consideration. But if you're a licensed Office 365 user, like an E3, E5, and there's a bunch of others, you're going to be able to use this pretty much out of the box from the get-go. Now, admins can turn it on or off if we need to, but you know, using reporting, using light governance, we can provide oversight and guidance and let you build the solutions that you need. And then using, you know, the admin features, we can turn off the premium connectors if we want. If we're compartmentalizing by environment, we can tie it into security groups if we need to. But if you're an Office 365 user, Power Automate's definitely going to be part of the process and doing a lot of things that we've done in Designer, you should be able to do with minimal or no cost associated with that. So there are some use rights with that. And the per license capacity for the daily API calls is currently 2,000 per user. That's 2,000 calls based off of an API. That's like an individual action inside of the workflow. There are some of you that might get pretty close to that. I had a friend who ran 1 million in a week because he ran a flow that was triggered every single time a hashtag appeared on Twitter during the Winter Olympics using the official Winter Olympics hashtag. I still give him a hard time for that even to this day. I don't recommend you do that, but for most business users falling in underneath 2,000 API requests daily, you're going to be fine. So you're going to be able to work with that. And then again, we can turn on or off the premium connectors there. So there's some licensing information for you. I'm going to skip that one because we're kind of at the end of time. Last couple of things. The work run history, 28 days. And an individual Power Automate, a flow, can only run for a 30-day period. But if you use a schedule and you run it every single day, there you go. You don't have to worry about the 30-day limit anymore. You just set whatever you need to set and you run it again tomorrow. You look at the same information, you loop through your list, run it again tomorrow, and that can definitely help with some of those limitations. So that's not all the limitations that are there. There's, you know, a whole bunch of blogs and documents out there. Microsoft has this article. This is the one that I was referencing as part of the presentation. This is the guidance to migrate from the classic workflows into Power Automate. This is where you're going to find that detailed breakdown between the two different workflow types. I'm going to put this in the Zoom window here in just a minute. This is where you can do this. I'll tweet this out this afternoon as well, and I'm sure Vlad and I'll figure out how to get you the PowerPoint and the blog and everything on a blog somehow. But the guidance is going to have a detailed breakdown of the one-to-one actions and what you can do. Definitely check that out. And hey, for those of you that want to get certified, there's a Power Platform Fundamental certification out there. I'm pretty sure we know somebody who has written a course on this.
Actually, 3 courses, but I think I know somebody.
I might know a guy. I think his name rhymes with Vlad. But yeah, definitely check out that fundamentals course. And with that, I'm just going to go all the way back to the very beginning. I know there's a bunch of questions in there. I'm going to stick around for a few minutes and try to take that. Find me on Twitter, find me on LinkedIn. I'll answer questions if I can. If not, I'll at least point you in the right direction or say, hey, you go talk to my buddies about this. But my contact information is there. I really do appreciate your time being here today. I know there were a ton of questions coming through. Thank you so much. I got a few more minutes. I can definitely stick around and take a few questions. Oh, wow, that's one heck of a chat window. But yeah. I hope you enjoyed it. And, you know, let me know if you need any training in the future. That's the end of my shameless plug. Vlad, do you have any kind of queued up that high priority you want me to answer, or you know, so I just grab a couple?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, thank you everybody for attending. For everybody that can stay a bit longer, we're all gonna go through the questions. And this is why I said at the beginning, I'm not going to take too much time because there's a lot of content. So if not, the recording, including the slides, guidance links, and this part of the question will also be in the recording. So if you have to jump off, you can always watch the end after. But okay, so let's get started. There's a lot of things. When to use Power Automate and when to use Logic Apps?
Logic Apps is really good for service accounts. Business process flows that have to work across the organization, like maybe, for longer workflow processes, for processes that involve maybe multiple departments, but also processes where you want to have a service account involved. That's when Logic Apps is definitely going to shine. There is a cost associated with every action that you run in a Logic app. It's fractions of a penny. It can add up over time, but I've definitely seen some really good governance around using Logic Apps for those business process flows and larger workflows versus like personal or team productivity.
Okay. A question, is there a way to lock future additions to a Power Automate flow? I'm not sure I 100% understand it as is, but I guess a way of actually kind of making sure nobody else edits it.
Yeah, I'm not sure
If
I
you,
understand that particular question.
okay. Ignacio, if you can add any details, please add them in there and we'll come back to it after. I tried. I was like, maybe it's something that I don't know and you know a bit more about, but okay. Let's see what else.
You're looking
Any
for one.
tips?
I know there's one out there. Are all SharePoint Designer workflows going to be turned off in November, including the 2013 workflows in Designer? The 2013 will be supported for a while longer. It's the 2010 custom workflows and the 2010 out-of-the-box workflows that are going to be turned off starting in November.
Yes, I answered that one via chat actually, but it's good
Okay.
to have it on the recording as well. A question that I've seen a few times, how can we create, the concept that we had of reusable workflows? How can we get that concept with Power Automate?
You can have a flow call a flow. So you can create a flow and then you can have a flow trigger that flow. That's the closest that we have to a reusable workflow.
Okay, so do a flow that calls a flow in Power Automate.
Yep.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, what else? There was some discussion on how to avoid the 2000 API calls, as that seems to be a limitation. I mean, 2000 seems like a lot, but I guess there's some big enterprises there that if they run everything under one service account, it can hit quite fast.
Yeah, that was kind of tricky. We used to have a bucket of flows, like your organization had a bucket. So if like you had 10,000 people and only, 10 used a flow, the organization had 2,000 flows per account, and you could use the bucket. I think that changed with the 2,000 API calls per day. So you might need to scale it out across a number of different service accounts. But also, if you're going to get into that, you might want to consider Logic Apps because that's going to be more for those that's more what Logic Apps is definitely going to be for. There is a fee associated with that, but I mean, it's fractions of a penny and it can add up over time, but I think that's kind of the sweet spot for the Logic Apps.
Awesome. Let me see what else. Can you interact with workflows when in progress, like stopping, updating data, going backwards, and all of this fun stuff?
Yeah, that's one of the things that the workflow history list allows you to do. So like you can interact with it. So like maybe you run it and you get an outcome, or you turn off the flow and that stops the process, or you terminate the flow and that stops the process. You can go back through the history list and you can like resend or resubmit or test based off of that data. You can interact with it in that capacity. And like the SharePoint Designer workflows, there's manual start options as well. So you can have an automatic trigger, but you could also create a manual start option for a similar workflow process and go back and rerun it on that.
Awesome. Sorry, I was on mute. Some questions about third-party workflows such as Nintex. So first question, will this affect Nintex workflows at all? Have you used Nintex before I even go in, or are you a professional in? I haven't ever personally used it, so I can only read the questions.
So no, it's not a knock on Nintex at all. I personally don't use the Nintex workflow. I've heard amazing things about it. I've seen demos on it. It looks really, really powerful. The reason I don't personally use it is because it's a third-party application, and I'm a SharePoint trainer. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I try to stick with as out of the box in the Microsoft stack as I can so that I don't get confused between the different tools and the functionality and tell someone something wrong. I try to be as accurate as possible when I can. So I don't personally work with the Nintex workflow tool, but I hear great things about it. That being said, I have my Microsoft 365 license. I'm in Office 365. I have SharePoint, Power Automates included with that. I'm going to use what I have out of the box. Again, not a knock against them. It's just I'm going to use what I have out of the box.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to skip the rest of Nintex stuff because I cannot help either. Okay, so let's see. Wondering what Power Automate actions might help with recreating SPD, SharePoint Designer workflows that manage permissions.
Yeah, that's the HTTP call to SharePoint, and then you're going to have to do a get. Yeah, your method's going to be get, I believe, and then you're going to need to do some JSON inside of there. Again, go check out Serge Lucas' blog on that one. Dr. Flow, item level permissions with Power Automate or Microsoft Flow. He's done that one. There's a bunch of updates on that one. That's how you're going to do item level permissions right now.
Awesome. And one last question as we're about 15 minutes over time. Any strategies for deployment for application lifecycle management for Power Automate?
Oh man, you saved the hardest question for last.
Well, that's why I said it's the last, because I know it might take you a while.
So I mean, I'm thinking like from a governance perspective off of that. So we're talking about lifecycle management with Power Automate. One of the things that I've seen that's been really successful is a light-handed approach, self-service flow creation, managing and doing reporting from the flow center, but also using PowerShell and keeping track of it that way. Providing office hours, and then when we need to step in and build a business process flow, do that, but have like an office hours set up for it, or have like a provisioning set up for it. One of the organizations that I contract with, they've done that to a lot of success. If there's a complicated flow, we'll work with them to build it, or we'll build it for them and then provision and launch it. And then we've got documentation around it and we can keep track of it. But opening it up for self-service is definitely something you're going to have to consider, because that's how Microsoft envisions it. And if you try to lock it down and turn it off, you're really going to inhibit your users' abilities to take advantage of this tool and do what they need to do. You can turn off the connectors that you don't want. You can use environments to limit services to security groups, and then you can use your reporting and that light-handed oversight to provide that guidance while letting users build what they need, and not taxing your IT team with the burden of managing all this. Now, I'm going to extend off of that just a little bit of a tangent. A lot of us are going to be scrambling for the next 4 months to rebuild our SharePoint Designer workflows in Power Automate. So a lot of our IT teams are going to be preoccupied with building flows all day, every day to replicate what we already have in our environment. Use this as an opportunity to maybe reapproach the process, document it correctly, make your export a copy of it, save it, provide documentation. But do internal webinars and train your people, skill your people up, upskill your people on this, so that you can provide that white management and do the governance that you need. And I know that's ideal, that's pie in the sky, but that's what I would recommend for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Andy. Thank you to everyone. I see there's still 100 people on, even if we passed by 15 minutes. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. Huge thanks to Andy. To give us time to the community and to answer all of the questions. And make sure you follow him on Twitter, LinkedIn. Most of the time he posts really interesting stuff, and I put him most of the time there. I was like, I cannot say all nice things. I had to put a little joke in there. And like I said earlier, we'll make sure to have the slides up on SlideShare. We're going to have the video up on YouTube. And if you're registered for this webinar, within about 48 hours max, all of this will be in your inbox. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. Stay safe. And after your webinar closes, you're going to be redirected to the upcoming list of webinars. So make sure to check it out and register if there's anything in there that interests you. So thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks, Vlad. Appreciate it.